my neighbor's daughter said. The landlord keeps stopping by when my parents are at work to check things that don't seem broken. Lily Chen knocked on my apartment door at 3:45 on a Wednesday afternoon, still wearing her high school backpack, her face showing that particular teenage expression of uncertainty mixed with determination. I was working from home that day, reviewing architectural plans for a commercial renovation project, when I heard her knock. She stood in the hallway of our building, fidgeting with her phone case. The 15-year-old from apartment 3B rarely spoke to me beyond polite hellos in the elevator. Her presence at my door was unusual enough that I knew immediately something was wrong. "Mr. Dalton, can I ask you something? It's about Mr. Brennan, our landlord." Her voice was quiet but steady. I stepped back from the doorway and gestured for her to come inside, leaving the door open because I understood how a teenage girl might feel about entering a neighbor's apartment alone. "Of course! What's going on?" She stayed near the door, gripping her backpack straps. "The landlord keeps stopping by when my parents are at work to check things that don't seem broken. He came yesterday to look at the bathroom faucet, but it works fine. Last week he checked the smoke detectors, even though we just had the building inspection. 2 weeks before that, he said he needed to verify the heating vents before winter. My parents work until 6, and he always comes between 3:30 and 5. He knows my schedule. He knows when I'm home alone." My stomach tightened with that immediate recognition of danger that comes from instinct before conscious thought catches up. I'd been living in this converted warehouse building for 6 years, long enough to know Stephen Brennan's patterns. He was meticulous about maintenance requests, often annoyingly so, but his visits were always scheduled during business hours when tenants were home or had given explicit permission for entry. The idea of him repeatedly accessing an apartment when only a teenager was present set off every warning signal I'd developed from years of reading case studies about predatory behavior. I'd been an architect, specializing in institutional buildings, schools, youth centers, places where safety protocols were critical. "How many times has this happened?" I asked, keeping my voice level and non-alarming. Lily pulled out her phone and opened a notes app. I started writing it down after the 3rd time because it felt weird. 12 visits in the past 2 months, always between 3:30 and 5:15, always when mom and dad are at work. He has legitimate reasons every time, checking the water pressure, inspecting the windows, looking at electrical outlets, testing the thermostat, but nothing ever needs fixing. He never actually repairs anything. 12 visits in 8 weeks. That wasn't maintenance. That was surveillance establishing a pattern of access, normalizing his presence in the apartment while she was alone, testing boundaries to see if she'd question his authority or accept his explanations. Classic grooming behavior disguised as landlord responsibilities. "Does he just check whatever he says he's there to inspect and then leave?" I asked. Lily shook her head and her grip on her backpack straps tightened. "He talks to me, asks about school, about my friends, about my plans for college. He knows I want to study art. Last week he said he has a friend who's a photographer who could help me build a portfolio. He said professional photos would help with college applications. He asked if I'd be interested in doing a photo session at his studio space. I didn't even know he had a studio space." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'd heard this pattern before in the safety seminars I'd attended for youth facility design. The excessive interest, the offers of special opportunities, the private sessions away from protective adults. This wasn't a landlord being friendly with a tenant. This was calculated predation. "Did you tell your parents about these visits?" I asked. She looked down at her shoes. "I mentioned it once. Mom said Mr. Brennan is just being thorough with building maintenance. Dad said we're lucky to have a landlord who actually cares about keeping things in good condition instead of ignoring problems. They don't see it as weird because he's the landlord. He's supposed to have access to our apartment. He's supposed to check on things. When I said it made me uncomfortable, Dad said I was being paranoid and that I should be grateful someone's looking out for the property. I tried to explain that nothing's actually broken, but Mom said preventive maintenance is smart. They trust him completely." This was the most dangerous part. The predator had institutional authority that made his access seem legitimate. Parents saw him as responsible rather than suspicious. A landlord checking on his property wasn't alarming to adults who didn't understand the pattern. Lily was isolated in her discomfort, her instincts telling her something was wrong, while the adults in her life dismissed her concerns as teenage paranoia. I'd seen this dynamic in case studies. Predators deliberately chose roles that gave them authorized access to children and teenagers, then used that authority to silence victims who tried to report concerning behavior. "Lily, I'm glad you came to me. Your instincts are right. This isn't normal landlord behavior. Have you ever been alone with him outside your apartment?" I needed to know if Brennan had already escalated beyond the apartment visits. She shook her head quickly. "No, but he keeps suggesting it. He said his studio space would be perfect for the photo portfolio. He mentioned going to an art gallery opening next month and said I should come with him, that it would be educational. He asked if I'd like to see the penthouse apartment he's renovating, said I might get design ideas for my own future place. Every time I make an excuse, but he keeps asking." My hands clenched into fists. Brennan was trying to isolate her, trying to get her into private spaces away from the apartment building where other tenants might notice his comings and goings. The photography portfolio offer was particularly concerning. I'd read enough about exploitation to know that photography sessions were common grooming tools, creating situations where clothing changes and posed positions could be normalized before escalating to actual assault. I need you to do something for me. Next time Brennan shows up at your apartment, text me immediately. Don't tell him you're texting anyone. Just send me a message. What's your number? She recited her number and I saved it in my phone, then sent her a text so she'd have mine. When he's there, try to keep your phone recording audio if you can do it discreetly. Put it in your pocket or leave it on the counter with the voice memo app running. We need documentation of what he says during these visits. Can you do that? Lily nodded, looking relieved that someone was taking her seriously instead of dismissing her concerns. Should I tell my parents you and I talked? I thought about that carefully. If her parents were dismissive, telling them might prompt them to confront Brennan directly, which would alert him that someone was paying attention to his pattern. We'd lose the element of surprise and any chance of documenting his behavior. Not yet. Let's gather evidence first so we have something concrete to show them. Parents sometimes need proof before they'll accept that someone they trust is dangerous. Right now, it's your word against a respected landlord who's never done anything overtly illegal. We need to document the pattern so clearly that no one can dismiss it. She looked uncertain, but nodded. Okay. Thank you for believing me, Mr. Dalton. Everyone else makes me feel crazy for being uncomfortable. You're not crazy. You're smart, and your instincts are protecting you. Always trust that feeling when something seems wrong. After Lily left, I sat at my desk staring at the architectural plans without seeing them. My mind was racing through what I knew about Stephen Brennan. He was 48 years old, owned 3 buildings in this neighborhood, always impeccably dressed in expensive casual clothes that made him look successful and trustworthy. He was charming in a calculated way, remembered everyone's names, asked about people's lives with apparent genuine interest. He'd been divorced twice, no children of his own, and he'd mentioned once that both ex-wives had been substantially younger than him. At the time, I dismissed it as midlife crisis behavior. Now it felt like a pattern. I pulled up my laptop and started researching landlord-tenant laws regarding unauthorized entry. Even though Brennan owned the building, he couldn't enter apartments without proper notice, except in emergencies. Checking smoke detectors and inspecting maintenance issues required 24 hours written notice in our state. I pulled out my own lease and found the clause about landlord access. It clearly stated that non-emergency entries required written notice delivered at least 1 day in advance. Had Brennan been providing that notice to Lily's family, or was he just showing up and using his authority to gain entry? I called Lily's number. She answered on the second ring. Mr. Dalton? Her voice sounded anxious. Quick question. When Brennan comes to your apartment, does he give your parents written notice beforehand? An email or a letter saying he'll be entering the apartment on a specific date? There was a pause. I don't think so. He just shows up and knocks. When I answer, he says he's there to check something. I let him in because he's the landlord, and I thought he was allowed to enter whenever he wanted. Perfect. That was a violation right there. Unauthorized entry, documented 12 times in 2 months. Lily, from now on, don't let him into the apartment. Tell him your parents said you're not allowed to let anyone in when they're not home, not even the landlord. If he insists, tell him he needs to come back when your parents are there or provide written notice 24 hours in advance. That's the law. You have the right to refuse him entry. I heard her breath catch. Won't that make him angry? What if he retaliates by evicting us or raising our rent? The fear in her voice made my chest tighten. She was afraid of making the predator angry, afraid of consequences for protecting herself. That's exactly what predators counted on, victims being too scared to enforce boundaries. He can't evict you for following the law. Your lease protects you, and if he tries to retaliate, that's illegal and we'll document it. You have more power here than you think. You just have to use it. After we hung up, I spent the next 3 hours researching Stephen Brennan. Property records showed he'd owned buildings in this area for 15 years. I found his social media profiles, carefully curated images of renovated apartments, professional photos of building exteriors, posts about being a responsible landlord and community member. Nothing overtly suspicious, but I noticed something in the comments. On a post from 8 months ago about completing a renovation on one of his buildings, someone had commented, "Stay away from my daughter." The comment had been deleted, but it was still visible in my browser cache when I dug deeper. I screenshot it. I found the commenter's profile. Dennis Kowalski, father of a teenage girl, previous tenant in one of Brennan's other buildings. I sent him a private message explaining who I was and asking if he'd be willing to talk about his experience with Brennan. While waiting for a response, I texted my friend Angela Foster, an attorney who specialized in housing law. I explained the situation without naming Lily or her family. Angela called me within 10 minutes. Owen, what you're describing is predatory behavior disguised as landlord maintenance. The unauthorized entries alone are enough for a harassment complaint. If he's specifically targeting a minor, this could be criminal. Have the parents filed any complaints? I explained that the parents weren't aware of the pattern because they trusted Brennan and dismissed their daughter's concerns. Angela swore under her breath. That's the problem. Without the parents on board, it's hard to take legal action on behalf of a minor, but document everything, every visit, every conversation, every attempt to isolate her. If this goes where I think it might go, You'll need a paper trail that shows clear predatory escalation. She paused. Owen, be careful. If Brennan realizes someone's paying attention to his behavior, he might escalate or he might back off and choose a different victim. Either way, this girl needs protection right now. I promised to keep her updated and asked what legal steps were available. Angela explained that we could file for a restraining order if we had sufficient evidence of harassment, but we'd need the parents to cooperate. We could also report the unauthorized entries to the housing authority, which might trigger an investigation. The nuclear option was contacting police with suspicion of attempted child predation, but that required more concrete evidence than we currently had. Dennis Kowalski responded to my message 2 hours later. He called me instead of messaging back. His voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. You're asking about Stephen Brennan? What's he done now? I explained the situation with my neighbor's daughter, the pattern of visits, the concerning conversations. Dennis let out a long breath. Same thing he did to my daughter, Caitlin. She was 14 when we moved into his building on Palmer Avenue. Within a month, Brennan was finding reasons to access our apartment when my wife and I were at work. Always when Caitlin was home alone after school. He'd check the plumbing, inspect the electrical outlets, test the smoke detectors. Caitlin mentioned it seemed excessive, but we thought he was just a meticulous landlord. Then one day Caitlin came home from school and found Brennan in our apartment. He said he'd used his master key to fix a leaking pipe, but there was no leak. She found him in her bedroom, standing by her dresser. He said he was checking the window locks. My stomach dropped. Brennan had already been in the apartment when Caitlin arrived home. That was a massive escalation from knocking and being let in. What happened after that? I asked. Caitlin was scared enough to call me at work. I left immediately and got home to find Brennan still there. He acted completely normal, showed me a window lock that he claimed was loose, had a whole story prepared. But Caitlin's bedroom had been disturbed. Drawers were slightly open, her clothes had been moved. I didn't have proof, but I knew. A father knows. Dennis's voice broke slightly. I confronted him carefully because I didn't want him retaliating against our lease. He denied everything, said he was just doing his job, made me feel paranoid for suggesting anything inappropriate. That night I installed a camera in Caitlin's room without telling Brennan. 2 days later, he entered our apartment again while we were at work and went straight to Caitlin's bedroom. The camera caught him going through her underwear drawer. I felt sick. The violation was so much worse than I'd imagined. Did you go to the police? Dennis laughed bitterly. I tried. Took the video evidence to the police station. They said it was concerning, but technically he owned the building and had legal access to the apartment for maintenance. They said unless he'd actually assaulted someone, it was a civil matter, not criminal. They suggested I file a restraining order and move. So that's what we did. We broke our lease, found a new place, filed a restraining order that Brennan fought, and eventually got dismissed because his lawyer argued he had legitimate business reasons to access his own property. The system failed my daughter completely. I'm sorry that happened. Did you warn other tenants in Brennan's buildings? I asked. Dennis's voice turned harsh. I tried. Posted about it online, but Brennan threatened to sue me for defamation. His lawyer sent a cease and desist letter. Without a criminal conviction, I couldn't publicly call him a predator without risking a lawsuit. I was protecting my family from further trauma, so I backed down. I've regretted it every day since. How many girls has he done this to because I stayed silent? I told Dennis I'd document everything happening with Lily and keep him updated. He gave me his contact information and made me promise to protect this girl better than the system had protected his daughter. After hanging up, I sat in the dark apartment feeling the weight of what I'd learned. Brennan had done this before. He had a pattern. Target teenage girls in his buildings, use landlord access to normalize his presence, escalate to entering apartments when the girls were home alone, eventually violate their private spaces. And he'd gotten away with it because the system gave landlords enormous power over tenants, especially when those tenants were afraid of retaliation through eviction or rent increases. My phone buzzed with a text from Lily at 5:30. He just left. Was here for 25 minutes. Said he needed to check the garbage disposal. It works fine. I recorded audio. My pulse quickened. Send me the recording, and write down everything you remember about the conversation while it's fresh. The audio file came through 3 minutes later. I plugged in headphones and listened. Brennan's voice was smooth and friendly, asking Lily about her day at school, commenting on her art project that she'd apparently mentioned in a previous conversation. He remembered details about her life with disturbing precision. Then his tone shifted slightly. You know, I've been thinking about that photography portfolio we discussed. My friend Derek does professional work, shoots for catalogs and advertisements. He's always looking for fresh faces. You have a very photogenic quality, Lily. Elegant bone structure. You could do some test shots and see if modeling might be something you'd enjoy. It pays well, and you mentioned wanting to earn money for art supplies. Lily's voice came through uncertain. I don't know. I'd have to ask my parents. Brennan's response was perfectly calibrated. Of course. Though sometimes parents don't understand the opportunities available in creative fields. They worry unnecessarily. You're 15, practically an adult, mature enough to make these kinds of decisions, but absolutely discuss it with them if you're more comfortable that way. The manipulation was textbook, suggesting she was mature enough to make decisions independently while technically deferring to parental authority. making her feel adult and sophisticated while undermining her instinct to involve her parents, separating her from protective adults by suggesting they wouldn't understand. I listened to the rest of the recording. Brennan spent several minutes talking about art galleries he'd visited, dropping names of artists Lily apparently admired, demonstrating knowledge of her interests that he'd gained through previous conversations. He mentioned the penthouse renovation again, said it had beautiful natural light that would be perfect for photography. The grooming was sophisticated and patient. He was building trust, establishing himself as someone who understood her interests, creating a sense of special connection. The recording ended with Brennan saying he'd come back next week to check the water heater. No mention of providing written notice. Just an assumption that he'd have continued access to the apartment when Lily was alone. I saved the recording to 3 separate locations: my computer, cloud storage, and an external drive. This was evidence of grooming, though not yet evidence of anything explicitly illegal. But combined with Dennis Kowalski's testimony about Brennan's previous behavior, a pattern was emerging that no one could dismiss as coincidence. I called Angela and played her the recording. She listened in silence. When it finished, she said, "That's grooming, clear as day. The isolation, the flattery, the offers of special opportunities, the suggestion that parents won't understand. But here's the problem. Nothing he said is technically illegal. He didn't threaten her, didn't make explicit sexual advances, didn't touch her inappropriately. A prosecutor would struggle to file charges based on this alone." My frustration boiled over. "So we just wait until he actually assaults her? That's the standard?" Angela's voice was firm. "No, we build a case that's so overwhelming no one can ignore it. You said there's a previous victim whose father has evidence? Get that. Document every unauthorized entry, record every conversation, show the pattern. Then we go to the police with everything and demand they investigate. We go to the housing authority with code violations. We go to every tenant in Brennan's buildings and warn them. We make enough noise that he can't hide anymore." She paused. "And Owen? You need to tell Lily's parents. Tonight. They need to know what's happening, even if they don't want to believe it." I knocked on apartment 3B at 7:15 that evening. Lily answered and her face fell when she saw my expression. "You're telling them, aren't you?" I nodded. "They need to know. This is too serious to keep from them." Her father, Thomas Chen, appeared behind her. He was in his late 40s, wearing business casual clothes, tired from a long day at work. "Owen, everything okay?" Thomas and I had a cordial neighbor relationship, occasional conversations in the elevator, nothing deep. This was about to get very uncomfortable. "I need to talk to you and your wife about something serious involving Lily and Stephen Brennan. May I come in?" His expression shifted from friendly to concerned. He called his wife Jennifer from the kitchen. The 3 adults sat in their living room while Lily stood near the hallway, anxious and defensive. I laid out everything. The 12 visits in 8 weeks, the unauthorized entries without proper notice, the concerning conversations about photography in private studios, the recording from that afternoon, and finally, Dennis Kowalski's story about Brennan doing the same thing to his daughter 3 years ago. Thomas and Jennifer listened with expressions that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally, horror. Jennifer spoke first. Her voice was shaking. "Stephen has been coming here for maintenance, legitimate maintenance. He's our landlord. He's supposed to check on things." I pulled out my phone and played the recording from that afternoon. As Brennan's voice filled their living room, talking about Lily's bone structure and mature decision-making, Jennifer's face drained of color. Thomas stood up and started pacing. When the recording ended, he turned to Lily. "Why didn't you tell us how uncomfortable this made you?" Lily's voice came out small. "I did tell you. You said I was being paranoid. You said we were lucky to have a landlord who cared about maintenance." The accusation hung in the air. Thomas and Jennifer exchanged a look of parental guilt. They'd dismissed their daughter's concerns. They'd failed to protect her because Brennan's behavior had seemed legitimate on the surface. Jennifer reached for Lily and pulled her into a hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry we didn't listen." Thomas looked at me with barely controlled rage. "What do we do? How do we stop him?" I explained what Angela had outlined. Document everything, file complaints with the housing authority, consider a police report, install security cameras in the apartment to catch any future unauthorized entries, and most importantly, revoke Brennan's access immediately. Send him a written notice tonight via email and certified mail stating that he no longer has permission to enter your apartment without your explicit written consent 24 hours in advance. If he enters without permission, that's criminal trespassing. Document every attempt he makes to contact Lily or access your apartment. Build an undeniable paper trail. Thomas was already pulling out his laptop. "I'm doing it right now." Jennifer looked at me with tears in her eyes. "How many other families has he done this to? How many girls?" I told her about my plan to contact other tenants in Brennan's buildings, to warn them, to find other victims who might come forward. Jennifer's expression hardened into determination. "I'm a social worker. I know how predators operate. I should have seen this. I'm trained to see this. He was so normal, so professional. I let my professional guard down because he was our landlord." Thomas finished typing the email and read it aloud. It was direct and legal, citing specific lease clauses about unauthorized entry, stating clearly that all future maintenance requests required written notice and the presence of both parents. He copied me on the email before sending it. Done. Now what? I suggested installing cameras immediately. Thomas ordered them online for next day delivery. We discussed moving out, but breaking their lease would cost thousands in penalties, and finding a new place would take time. Better to stay and document Brennan's response to being confronted. At 11 that night, my phone rang. It was Thomas. Brennan responded to the email. You need to hear this. He read Brennan's response aloud. It was smooth and apologetic, expressing surprise that his maintenance visits had caused discomfort, claiming he'd only been trying to ensure the apartment was well maintained, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding. He agreed to provide written notice for all future entries and apologized if his friendly interest in Lily's art career had been misinterpreted. The response was perfectly crafted to make the Chens seem like they'd overreacted. No admission of wrongdoing, just expressions of innocent intentions misunderstood. Thomas sounded frustrated. He's making us look paranoid. What if we're wrong? What if he really was just being friendly? I understood the doubt. Predators were skilled at making victims question their own instincts. You're not wrong. Play that recording again. Listen to how he talks to your 15-year-old daughter about her bone structure and mature decision-making. That's not friendly landlord conversation. That's grooming. Trust your gut. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're right. God, you're right. I almost let him manipulate me again. How do they do that? They do it through years of practice, I thought. Through understanding how to exploit people's desire to believe the best in others, how to use authority and respectability as camouflage, how to make reasonable people doubt their own reasonable concerns. The next morning, I began contacting other tenants in Brennan's 3 buildings. I started with the building managers, explaining I was researching potential code violations and tenant complaints. One manager, a woman named Iris Whitfield, who oversaw Brennan's property on Palmer Avenue, was surprisingly forthcoming. You're asking about Stephen? Interesting timing. I just had a tenant complain last week that he's been entering her apartment without proper notice. Young woman, early 20s, lives alone. She said it made her uncomfortable, but she didn't want to make waves. I asked for her contact information. Iris hesitated, citing privacy concerns, but finally agreed to pass along my number and ask the tenant to call me if she wanted to discuss it. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The woman identified herself as Simone Fletcher. She sounded wary. Iris said you're investigating Stephen Brennan? What's this about? I explained the situation with Lily, keeping details vague to protect her identity. Simone was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. He's been doing the same thing to me. Started about 6 weeks ago. He comes by every few days to check something. The sink, the windows, the heating vents. Always when I'm home alone. He knows my work schedule because I mentioned it once in passing. Last week, he showed up at 8 at night claiming he'd seen a leak in my ceiling from his apartment above mine. There was no leak. He stayed for 20 minutes asking about my personal life, commenting on my appearance, suggesting we grab coffee sometime to discuss building improvements. I felt cold anger settle in my chest. Simone was in her 20s, legally an adult, but the pattern was identical. Unauthorized entries, excessive interest in her personal life, attempts to establish private connections outside the landlord-tenant relationship. Have you documented any of this? I asked. She said she'd started taking notes after the 3rd visit, but hadn't known what to do with them. I explained about the legal requirement for written notice before entry, told her she could revoke his access just as the Chens had done. I also told her about Dennis Kowalski and his daughter. Simone's breath caught. There are other victims? This is a pattern? I said yes, and asked if she'd be willing to speak with Angela, the housing attorney. She agreed immediately. Over the next 3 days, I spoke with 5 more tenants in Brennan's buildings. 3 were young women who reported similar unauthorized visits and uncomfortable personal conversations. One was a single mother whose teenage daughter had mentioned Brennan's excessive interest in her college plans. Another was a couple who'd noticed Brennan spent significantly more time in apartments occupied by young women or families with teenage daughters compared to apartments with male tenants or older residents. The pattern was undeniable. Angela compiled everything into a comprehensive complaint. 8 separate accounts of unauthorized entry, multiple instances of inappropriate personal interest in minors and young women, testimony from Dennis Kowalski about Brennan's previous behavior, recorded conversations showing grooming tactics. She filed complaints with the City Housing Authority and the State Real Estate Commission that oversaw landlord licensing. She also prepared a police report documenting suspicion of stalking and attempted child predation. The Housing Authority responded first. An inspector showed up at Brennan's properties and found multiple code violations: missing carbon monoxide detectors, insufficient emergency lighting, improper fire extinguisher maintenance. The violations gave the authority leverage to place Brennan under increased scrutiny. Every complaint from tenants would now trigger mandatory inspections. The Real Estate Commission was slower to act, but eventually opened an investigation into Brennan's conduct. The process was bureaucratic and frustrating, but it created an official record that couldn't be dismissed. The police were the most disappointing. Detective Ronald Phillips took our report but seemed skeptical. This is concerning behavior, but nothing here is explicitly criminal. He's a landlord accessing his properties. The conversations are inappropriate but not illegal. Unless someone makes a specific allegation of assault or explicit sexual harassment, there's not much we can investigate. Angela pushed back hard. He's targeting minors. He's using his position as landlord to gain access to teenage girls when their parents aren't present. He's grooming them with offers of photography sessions and private meetings. The pattern shows clear predatory intent. Detective Phillips looked tired. I understand your concern, but intent isn't a crime. Actions are crimes. If he touches someone inappropriately, if he makes an explicit sexual advance, if he uses his landlord position to threaten or coerce someone, those are crimes. What you're describing is creepy behavior that doesn't rise to criminal charges. I wanted to scream. The system required victims to be actually assaulted before taking action. Preventing the assault apparently wasn't a priority. Angela wasn't finished. What about Dennis Kowalski's video evidence showing Brennan going through his daughter's underwear drawer? That's criminal behavior. Phillips pulled up the old case file. Mr. Kowalski filed a report 3 years ago. We investigated. Brennan claimed he was checking for signs of water damage in the dresser area after a pipe leak. Without explicit proof that he was acting with sexual intent rather than landlord duties, the district attorney declined to prosecute. The restraining order request was denied for the same reason. The system was designed to protect property owners, not vulnerable tenants. Brennan had learned exactly how to exploit that protection. After leaving the police station, Angela and I sat in her car discussing next steps. The official channels are too slow and too skeptical. We need public pressure. We need to make enough noise that ignoring this becomes more damaging than addressing it. I knew what she meant. We needed media attention. The story was compelling. Respected landlord systematically targeting young women and teenage girls in his properties, using his authority to gain unauthorized access, grooming potential victims with offers of special opportunities. Multiple families affected, authorities slow to act, system failing to protect vulnerable people. Angela had connections with investigative journalists. She reached out to a reporter named Valerie DeSanto, who worked for the city's main newspaper and specialized in stories about systemic failures and abuse of power. Valerie was interested immediately. She interviewed the Chen family, Dennis Kowalski, Simone Fletcher, and 2 other tenants who'd experienced Brennan's unwanted attention. She reviewed all the evidence Angela had compiled. The story ran 6 days later on the front page of the Sunday paper. The headline read, "Local landlord accused of targeting female tenants in pattern of harassment and unauthorized access." The article was devastating. It laid out Brennan's pattern in detail, included quotes from multiple victims, described the housing authority's investigation, and highlighted the police department's reluctance to investigate, despite multiple complaints. The article included Brennan's professional photo alongside photos of his buildings. It was careful to use words suggesting allegations rather than proven facts, avoiding defamation, but the implication was clear. Stephen Brennan was a predator, using his position as landlord to target vulnerable women. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, 15 more women had come forward with similar stories about Brennan. Some were current tenants, others were former tenants who'd moved away, but remembered uncomfortable interactions. The Housing Authority announced an expanded investigation. The Real Estate Commission suspended Brennan's property management license pending review. Most importantly, parents in Brennan's buildings organized meetings to discuss safety measures and compared notes about concerning behavior they'd each dismissed individually, but recognized as part of a pattern when viewed collectively. Brennan hired a crisis management firm and an aggressive defense attorney. They issued a statement claiming the allegations were fabricated by disgruntled tenants, that Brennan was a victim of a coordinated smear campaign, that his professional reputation was being destroyed by hearsay and speculation. The statement mentioned lawsuits for defamation against everyone involved. The threats were empty. Angela had been careful to document everything, to avoid making claims we couldn't support, to let the pattern speak for itself. Brennan's lawyers knew that suing would mean discovery, depositions, testimony under oath. It would expose everything he'd been hiding. The threats were designed to intimidate people into silence, but this time, too many people were speaking up. The silence had been broken and couldn't be restored. Brennan's tenants started a rent escrow account, collectively withholding rent until the Housing Authority's investigation was complete. It was legal under tenant protection laws and economically devastating for Brennan. His mortgage payments on 3 buildings continued while rental income stopped. His reputation collapsed overnight. Property management companies refused to work with him. Contractors declined jobs on his buildings. The crisis management firm dropped him after 2 weeks when more allegations surfaced. 3 weeks after the newspaper article, Detective Phillips called me. His tone was different, more serious. "Mr. Dalton, we've received new information about Stephen Brennan. A woman came forward claiming he sexually assaulted her 4 years ago when she was a tenant in his building. She never reported it at the time because she was afraid of retaliation, but seeing other women come forward gave her courage. We're opening a criminal investigation." Finally, the system was responding. The assault allegation changed everything. Police obtained search warrants for Brennan's properties. They found cameras hidden in common areas of his buildings, positioned to monitor when tenants came and went. They found files on his computer containing photos of female tenants taken without their knowledge, including photos taken inside apartments during maintenance visits. The photos weren't explicitly sexual, but they showed an obsessive documentation of women's private spaces. Dresser drawers, closets, bathroom medicine cabinets. The invasion of privacy was staggering. Most damning, they found a spreadsheet tracking female tenants' schedules. Work hours, class schedules for college students, after-school activities for teenagers. Brennan had been systematically surveilling the women and girls in his buildings, documenting their routines, identifying when they'd be alone and vulnerable. The evidence was overwhelming. Brennan was arrested on multiple charges: criminal sexual assault from the 4-year-old allegation, stalking, harassment, illegal surveillance, computer crimes related to the hidden cameras. The bail hearing was packed with victims and their families. I sat with Thomas and Jennifer Chin, watching Brennan stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit. The confident, charming landlord was gone. In his place stood a predator exposed. The prosecutor argued for high bail, citing Brennan's resources and flight risk. The defense attorney argued he was a respected property owner being railroaded by mob mentality. The judge set bail at $500,000. Brennan couldn't make it. He remained in custody awaiting trial. The media coverage intensified. National news picked up the story. Stephen Brennan became a symbol of how predators use positions of authority to access victims, how systems failed to protect vulnerable people, how collective action and public pressure could force accountability when official channels moved too slowly. The housing authority revoked Brennan's permits to operate rental properties. His buildings were placed in receivership while investigations continued. Tenants were given options to break their leases without penalty or stay under new management with proper safety measures in place. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but Brennan's attorney negotiated a plea deal. Facing overwhelming evidence and testimony from 17 victims, Brennan pled guilty to reduced charges: third-degree sexual assault, stalking, criminal harassment, illegal surveillance. The plea deal carried a prison sentence of 12 years. At sentencing, victims were allowed to give impact statements. Dennis Kowalski spoke about his daughter's trauma, about being dismissed by authorities, about the guilt of not doing more to stop Brennan. Simone Fletcher spoke about feeling unsafe in her own home, about the violation of discovering she'd been photographed without consent. Lily Chen spoke last. She was 16 now, a year older, but years wiser. She stood at the podium and faced Brennan directly. "You used your authority to make me feel powerless. You counted on adults dismissing my concerns. You exploited the trust people place in landlords. But I asked for help, and someone believed me, and that stopped you from hurting me the way you hurt others. I hope every day in prison you think about the girls you didn't get to victimize because one teenager asked the right question and one neighbor took her seriously." The judge sentenced Brennan to 12 years in state prison, to be followed by lifetime registration as a sex offender and permanent prohibition from working in property management or any position involving access to private residences. It wasn't enough. No sentence could undo the harm he'd caused, the lives he'd violated, the trust he'd destroyed. But it was justice, imperfect and delayed, but finally delivered. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief when the sentence was announced. Brennan was led away, without showing emotion. After sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with the Chen family. Lily hugged me tightly. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for not making me feel crazy." Thomas shook my hand with tears in his eyes. "You saved our daughter. How do we ever thank you for that?" I told them the truth. Lily saved herself by trusting her instincts and asking for help. I just made sure someone listened. 3 years later, I ran into Lily at an art gallery opening. She was 19, confident, studying studio art at university. She introduced me to her parents and her younger sister, who was now the age Lily had been when Brennan targeted her. The family had moved to a different building, but stayed in the neighborhood. Lily told me she'd started volunteering with a nonprofit that taught teenagers about predatory behavior and boundary violations. She used her experience to help other young people recognize danger and trust their instincts. "You know what I tell them?" she said. "I tell them that if something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And if adults dismiss your concerns, find different adults who will listen. Someone will believe you. You just have to keep asking until you find them." We stood together looking at her artwork displayed on the gallery wall, and I thought about how close we'd come to a different ending, how easily she could have been another victim instead of a survivor who turned trauma into purpose. Justice hadn't been swift, but it had been certain, and that certainty, that predators could be stopped, that victims could be heard, that systems could eventually respond, made all the difference. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.